Hi, everybody. As it always invariably goes, uh, a long time no meet between me and Pratik, and I think, but I mean, it's better late than never. So, I think the last session we discussed temple sites that the two of us traveled to, and today we are back with some subject on literature. So this is a book on called Devotion and Dissent by edited by Vijay Ramaswamy. It's the book is situated in a larger context on how religion had to be understood, or rather bhakti had to be understood in the Indian context. Let's say there is the Marxian position from starting from D.D. Kosambi, taken up by Keshav and Velutat, which is that religion is bhakti was produced by the state. It was a state commissioned project that involved hegemony over people. So this book, while agreeing with some points in that, is largely a departure from that position. It's like a it dissents against that position, and it's a very very long book with essays about Hinduism, or what we call Hindu cults or Puranic Bhakti cults, and Islam, different strains of Islam in India, Christian, and then it ends here with modern times. There are two essays at the end by Narayana on Narayana Guru uh, of the Ereva community. And uh, Pratik and I will be discussing two particular essays. I think they're one of the earliest essays in the book, and they are on relatively well-known cults. At least, I mean, I've always known about these cults, and they are about this institutions of patriarchy and caste, which are probably the two most important institutions that dissent had anyways to be staged against. Um, and those two essays were written by uh, Vijay Ramaswamy, the author of the book, the editor of the book itself. It's called Women in Love. It's on the Lingayat movement, on the Veerashaiva community. And the other is by Rohini Mokashi Punekar, which is titled Dissenting Voices, and that's on the Varkaris, Marathi poets around whose bhakti was spun around the cult of Vitobha or Vithala of Pandharpur. And I think so. The plan today for today's discussion is that Pratik will start by introducing Ramaswamy's essay on the Veerashaivas, and we will discuss our view, each of our what we thought about the essay and some ideas in the essay, and then I'll introduce Punekar's essay on Eknath and Chokha Mela, and we will talk about that essay as well. So off to Pratik, and I think I should say hi Pratik first, and I forgot to say it.
Hi, Revant. Hi.
Yeah.
To introduce the basic plot of Vijay Ramaswamy's essay, Mr. Ramaswamy is trying to do a very, very interesting thing here by combining two major, forces of dissent. In the sense, one is dissenting patriarchy, the other dissenting casteism, and how the Veerashaiva tradition combines both. I mean, how does it view both of these two factors of patriarchy and casteism? And first, to introduce, she does speak about love being central to devotion, and she goes into bhakti being effeminate in essence and all of that. And then, of course, we will discuss a little in detail about that. But let me just introduce the whole plot. She goes on to speak about gendering of spirituality. How the bhakta is always a woman, and the god is always the man, and there she brings in how the religious perceptions are gendered in the bhakti movements. And then the essay goes on to speak on Basava, the 12th century saint poet, or the cult leader of the Veerashaiva movement, which again, being a Brahmin, how he dissented the caste system, and about intercaste marriages, what had happened, and the political repercussions that it had. And then the essay goes on to speak about how the evil is personified as the other gender, like how Basava speaks about Maya as a woman and that she will come and destroy you and all of that. And how does gender play into perceiving Maya or illusion or something that is bad as being of the opposite gender, or woman specifically, or is it woman or is it the opposite gender? That is a discussion she makes. Then she also goes into the societal aspects of the movement, in the sense, though there is a very angered approach against patriarchy, saying women are coming up, say Akka Mahadevi or Aidaki Lakkama or Satyaka, so many figures she speaks about. Even then, there is no place for them to become a Jangama or become the pontiff, and that kind of social structure she examines and says, yes, there is an empowerment, but there is a layering of both. She says it's not like you're ultimately liberated from all the clutches of patriarchy or something like that. And then she examines very interestingly married women saints who rebel, and then there are unmarried women saints who say, I'm not even going to enter the institution of human marriage, so to say, or mundane marriage. Maybe transcendental marriage is a different thing, but that is something, a distinction she makes, and then she dwells on that. And at last she makes this, basically you are a devotee who becomes a bride, a bhakta becomes a bride, and that and the bride then becomes an androgyne, and that's how she concludes her essay. So that's a very broad overview. I think we'll go into the details now, I think.
Yeah, sure. The essay is structured in an interesting way, in that it takes up, first it introduces a concept that's become like a cliche in talking about bhakti literature, which is that the bhakta has a Nayika bhava. So there is that. So that's it's become a cliche to see that as a rebellion against patriarchy of some kind. That like irrespective of
man becoming
whether it's a man or a woman, they become a woman in the relationship. But having said that, then I think she builds layer upon layer. So the next layer is to say that actually that's not always the case. Even if the bhakta is feminine, other normal human women are seen as distraction. That is part of a larger trend that's seen across Hindu texts of all eras, but across religions and across time and the world itself. Like the women are seen like other intoxicants, other sort of distractions from the world, And I think upon that there are the other layers that you're talking about, which is that sometimes men, there is this notion that women can be that women are seen as Maya, and that both women and men can be Maya, and finally that women itself can be both, everything. Like, so that kind of a thing. So, but one question, I don't know if I should bring this up so early on, is that to me the most interesting feature, like the biggest challenge in this, and like, I think it's a very inspiring kind of philosophy, because there is a lot of diversity, but there are some almost scandalous content. There's some scandalous content as well. But
which we will discuss. In which I do have some disagreements, which also we will discuss.
Yeah, but to me the most I think a good question to pose all the texts is, Shiva is like because there is the entire religion is situated around Shiva, around the linga, the Ishtalinga. God can never be another religion of another gender. God is always gendered, I think. Like, yes. The bhakta can be of all genders across different the Vachanakaras, the other different poets in the Lingayat tradition. Maya can be of multiple genders, but God is always male. So that, I think, that is a big challenge, because we know that there are other traditions in India, other literature, where that's not the case. I mean, God can also change, can also
well, there, see, one thing is, in these, take the Vaishnava cult in Tamil Nadu or the Veerashaiva cult in Karnataka. Yeah. In all these cases, yes, the Bhagavan is Purusha. There is no doubt about it. God is the male. Yeah. And the Bhakta can be a male or a female. Female is seen a little, at least the Bhava of female is seen a little above than that of male. And that, I think, is even Vijaya Ramaswamy explores when she says that there is a body centrism of a woman in these things. Yeah. And also she goes on to say that, see, because there is this element of being submissive in devotion, being accepting of whatever the man says, and that is innate for a woman. And therefore, if you are a woman in this God-human relationship, then it means that you are a better devotee because submissiveness and obedience is the innate characteristic of a woman. That patriarchal mentality is there to even this thing, instead of romanticizing, this angle can also be, viewed critically. The second point, that to say that, see, God can be a woman, like for example, you take the Shakta cults, for example. Now, in those cults, there is either a Matru Bhava, thinking of her as the mother, or a Dasya Bhava as a devotee. I don't think we find Shringara Bhava in that case. If the God is a woman, no one sings as a male saying, I love you. That's never happening. So I think that again is gendered in the sense that there is a prohibition there.
Right. Yeah. And so you had some other point to make.
So one thing is, there's a very interesting point that Ramaswamy makes, that bhakti is feminine and Vaidika yajnas are masculine. I found it very interesting to say that very rote rituals and, the fire rituals and all of that, that's a very, very, conventionally you can look at it as a very masculine thing. But then the very, emotional bhakti is seen as feminine because it's very bhava filled, devotion filled and all that, emotion filled. But again, there is a concept of gender stereotyping there. But one more thing is, even there is a textual base for that, I would say. In Bhagavatam, for example, if you take, when bhakti says, is personified, it is personified as a woman only. And she says, Jnana and Vairagya are my children, and I'm crying, whatever the story be. But the personification in a traditional sense of bhakti has always been feminine. When Vijaya Ramaswamy writes that love is central to devotion in India or in anywhere, I am reminded of Narada Smriti, Narada Bhakti Sutra, which says, while defining bhakti, what is bhakti? Narada says, Satvasmin Parama Prema Rupa. So again, the starting is with sa, not saha. So bhakti is envisioned as woman only. Satu asmin Parama Prema Rupa. The prema, love's superlative degree is bhakti. That's all he says. And he uses the feminine pronoun there. So that's a very interesting point she makes, and how she brings it in the context of the Lingayat tradition, Sharane Sati Lingapati. And that was very interesting.
Yeah.
Would you want to go into the caste equations of Basava?
I think you can introduce that as well. Then we can probably discuss.
Sure. So Basava being a Brahmin, for those who have not read the essay, Basava being a Brahmin underwent the Upanayana and all the sacred ceremony and all of that. By 16 years, he cuts off all his, sacred thread and all of that. And he gives himself to this Linga Bhakti.
Actually, I think we could do one thing. We could probably introduce Lingayat tradition, irrespective of the essay. So I think I'll just do a little of that. Please. So the Lingayat tradition, I mean, its origins are really mysterious, I think, even today, like, because there is so many of the sort of staunch Lingayats claim that they are not Veerashaiva. That Veerashaivism and Lingayat religion are two separate entities and communities altogether. But let's say broadly, its progenitor is seen to be Basaveshwara or Basavanna, who was a minister. Kalachuri Court, Kalachuri Court, under Bijala, I think, Bijala the first. This is based in Palki or Basava Kalyanam in present-day Bidar district. It's quite close to Bidar. So and I think the sort of ingenuity of Basava is in how far they depart from several essences, let's say, of the Hindu tradition, or what's called Hindu tradition. Though there is, first of all, one thing that many people know about Lingayatism is that they do not believe in the immolation. They do not believe in funerals. So they bury their dead, and the one reason that's often offered is that the Ishtalinga is with them, so they do not need any purification or anything, any of the different sort of samskaras that the funeral pyre does. So they're already with Shiva. So they carry, instead of the sacred thread, they carry the Ishtalinga, or it's a round object that they wear around their neck. So they depart from let's say burning the dead. And then the other thing that depart from is the Vedas. So many of the rituals that are that come from the Vedas also they completely reject, and they don't. I don't think they believe that the Vedas are immortal, or that there's Shruti or anything like that. For one, I mean, a lot of it is centered around the words, the very swaras of Linga and Shiva. Since Shiva does not occur in the Vedas, as far as I know, so the Vedas do not hold are not of great value, because Shiva is God. So if a text that does not have the word Shiva cannot be of value to them at all. And the other thing that they do not believe in is the cycle of karma. And finally, as I said, birth, death, and rebirth. They do not believe in that cycle as well, because again, the fact that the Ishtalinga sort of transcends all of these things that other Hindu sort of custom, other Hindu sects have erected. And finally, they believe that it's an open sort of criticism of idol worship, and I think that in that they share a lot in common with many of the other bhakti traditions, and even other sort of Nastika traditions as well, like Buddhism. But I mean, one thing, like personally, one thing that's completely ironic is that the two biggest critics of idol worship in India, like Buddha and Basava, are the ones with the tallest statues, right? Like, you go to Karnataka, especially North Karnataka, it's almost a competition among Lingayats to construct the tallest statues of Basava. That probably because they don't believe in the idol worship. Otherwise, probably there is some tendency in human nature itself to have some kind of idol. I don't know. They don't believe
rebelling against the rebel.
Sorry?
The people are rebelling against the rebel, saying we will construct statues.
Yeah. And so they believe so in sort of metaphysics, there is this notion of Jangama and Jada. Jada is the one that does. Jada means that which does not move, something that is sort of sunken, something that is dry, something that is frozen. It's immobile or unchanging. So that is Jada. And Jangama is one that changes, dynamic, swift, moving, sort of full of rhythm and music. So all of these are Jangama. So they believe in Jangama Shiva. So that is Jada Shiva is, let's say, the Shiva in the Murti Rupa or Linga Rupa even. Shiva that does not move. The temple is the Jada Shiva, the Shiva that does not move. And Jangama Shiva is the Shiva that moves. And the Shiva that moves, Jangama Shiva is the Shaiva himself. The Veera Shaiva is the Jangama Shiva. So the Lingayat saints are they are part of the worship, because they are the very Shivas that actually move. Yeah. So that's my introduction. So I think already there is some kind of a criticism of caste in this. But you can go ahead.
Yes. So in this context, perhaps there's one incident we can bring in where Haralaya and Madhavaya in 1167, one is a Dalit and the other one is a Brahmin. When the daughter and son of these two were to get married, there was the political repercussions were huge. And 1167 they were executed, and the Kalachuri king Bijala himself was murdered by 3 Veerashaivas. And many vachanas were burnt, and there was a huge political turmoil that this movement had caused, and in the 12th century. So, but yes, I think after that, these vachanas that we have today as evidences of what the movement, metaphysically believed or whatever values that they held, is from Shunya Sampadane, which was compiled around 200 years later in 1400 CE by Mahadevaya. So that's again, these are the effects that the movement has had on society would have been really, really huge, I think, to go to this level. Yeah. And it still continues today. I mean, they're saying that, we are not Hindus because we don't believe in the Vedas, give us something separate. I think the repercussions are there even today.
I mean, but I think a lot of as happens with politics, I think a lot of it is it's retrospective and reconstructive. It's constructivist in that, the still majority opinion will still be that they are Hindus only. It will still be some part of the intelligence, I would say. But I think one thing, irrespective of, let's say, Lingayat religion, Pratik, I feel that I don't know if you might disagree with me or agree, I don't know, but often many the criticism of class always is harsher and earlier precedes the criticism of gender hierarchies, I feel. And I think we see that in this as well, that the sense that I'm getting is that it's the caste is unequivocally criticized. It's almost like almost people are criticizing caste. It's almost, I mean, it's in the very structure of what it means to be Lingayat, there is there's some departure, there is some rupture in what was considered Hindu or what was considered Bhakti, Shiva Bhakti. But as you can see, in the case of gender, that's not happening. Right? There is as we already discussed, it's a much more complicated picture. I think that's why that's I think, at least in my own, let's say, what I've read about Lingayat culture, or Lingayat the Vachana tradition, Vijay Ramaswamy's contribution is in showing that there is a diversity in that as well. There is a heterogeneity. For example, there is this really something about the untrustable, like this seems like something that any other literature could be having. For example, I think this is by what's it? This is by Basava himself. In fact, he's the very person who is often he sees himself as the wife of Shiva, and so he says, for example, to give me birth, Maya bore me as mother. To delight me, Maya was born as my daughter. To embrace me, Maya shared my bed as my wife. So many different ways she has, Maya, to worry and trouble me. Not in my power to unhinge this Maya. And you are amused, oh Kudala Sangama Deva. So in this, I think, but he's definitely a man. I think that is sort of clear, because there is, I mean, everybody else is woman. So it's sort of the idea is that he's a man. He's not
a wife. So
yeah. So there is a wife, there is a mother, there is a daughter. And this is not that Nayaka Nayika Bhakti Bhava is not in this. It's a much more abstract. So Shiva and Bhakta and Maya. Even the word Maya itself is a feminine word. Right. So it's taking the sort of feminine form. So probably, one argument could be that he can't help it. Maya is already a feminine word, so he can't do much but use it as in sort of human feminine forms, because let's say even in Buddhism also Mara is feminine, like it goes thousands of years before him as well.
Certainly.
But let's say the verse that Ramaswamy accepts next, there that's actually more interesting and more very sort of complicated. He says her speech, this is about I think it's about a wife, I think, or lover. Her speech, so some kind of female companion, okay, some female romantic companion of some sort. Her speech is like dark sugar, but I have seen, oh Lord, strong poison in her heart. She will invite one lover with her eyes, another man is hidden in her heart. Oh Lord of the meeting rivers, listen, one must not trust the woman, the thief of men. So again, a Lord of the meeting rivers is a translation of Kudala Sangama Deva.
Yes.
Right, Kudala Sangama. Which is, by the way, it is in Bhagalpur district of Karnataka today. It's considered it's also the place of the sort of nirvana of Basava as well. Now, so where was I? So here it's not even about the wife distracting him from the bhakti or getting immersed in Shiva. It is the wife doing normal worldly things. Like, it's a very, very worldly concern. That his problem here is that she's supposed to be a wife. She's supposed to be my wife, but she's having affairs with other men. It's not even that I am supposed to I should be immersed in you, but I mean, she's because of her, let's say, body, I'm getting distracted. It's that she's supposed to be my wife, but she's being with someone else.
So I think that's a very interesting point that you bring. I'll also add something to this. See, there is a generalization of woman being this way. That is evidently seen. But what I find very interesting is the same woman body that he is heavily criticizing now, or woman's actions and bodies that Basava is criticizing now, he will impersonate as means of his bhakti tomorrow. So that contradiction is there. I mean, the very opening. I mean, because I'm more familiar with the Tamil Divya Prabandham tradition. So let's take Thirumangai Alvar. The most number of Shringara Pasarams are with him. I mean, it's his composition. But the very beginning of his magnum opus Periya Tirumozhi, he says, "Madarar valaikane pato." They have these net-like eyes which will catch you up, and says, "Oh, how many days, oh Lord, I've sinned, catching on to the voluptuous breasts of these women. What sins have I done?" So he's literally, showing contempt for woman's body. After a few songs, he is going to become the woman and say, "Oh, my breasts are voluptuous. Won't you come and hug me?" to Krishna. So the same woman's body these people are using when it comes to the mundane, they are keeping it at bay. When it becomes transcendental, they want to adopt it themselves. So I think that's a very interesting irony that we find here.
Yeah, I think reading literature of this kind probably sort of historicizes bhakti as well. That it's actually, I don't know. I mean, it's once you start reading this, it becomes like an obvious fact that bhakti is a historically constructed notion. But it's I mean, when you're outside of this sort of when you're outside of reading sort of an academic, at least academic angle of this literature, it will be like that's completely human thing. Like it's always been there. People have always had some kind of bhakti or not had bhakti. It's like bhakti is like an essential human feeling. That's and it's almost like it's a homogeneous human quality. But I think that these literature like this, I think can break all of that, because it sort of sheds light at the poetic process. The poetic process is part of it is original, that you need to construct something new. Like you need to think of new metaphors, new similes. Or I mean, I think we will definitely discuss some of the other verse vachanas which are so scandalous. I'm pretty sure there must have been I mean, either I mean, there must be like one of a kind if it's time, and even if there are other literature also, I don't know if those people would have read them. So there is some original quality to them, but there is always also trope. So, that so it's I think if in Tirumangay Alvar or in Basava, both of these things are happening, and in both there's equal investment. Like it's not like I mean, if you read one of them, you would think that person really, really believes it's coming from the deep depth of his heart. Same, likewise with the other also. So I think what's happening is that both of these molds already exist. That there is already exists this sort of mold of seeing yourself as a heroine, as a wife of or lover of the Lord, and there's also the other thing which is of seeing women as a distraction, or the other, the second option. Second is slightly different. It's not just as women as a distraction, but that women as untrustable. That they are that you will be cuckolded. There's that insecurity. There's that fear. So both of these exist, and they're tapping on either of them, at different points. Whenever it suits them. So it's, I mean, I think that way it's sort of hard to attempt some kind of deconstruction of a psychology or the personal politics of that person. And the second concern will always exist, which is that we don't even know if it's by one person. Like that will be there always. That each person could be like a proxy for multiple people, which will be a sort of eternal question.
Possible, yes.
Yeah. And so about the scandalous thing, the thing that I was thinking of. I mean, you also probably noted it down. You can probably read like half if you already have it like right next to you.
No, you read it.
Which is Akka Mahadevi. So there's this I think the four most well-known Vachanakaras are Basava, Devara Dasimaya, Akka Mahadevi, and Allama Prabhu. I mean, there is a lot of mythology about, Basava is supposed to be the founder, but there's a lot of story about each of these people. So Akka Mahadevi is one of these sort of like, one of the, let's say, she's become some kind of a feminist icon. Like Andal and Akka Mahadevi like seem as some kinds of parallels. But I think Akka Mahadevi is much more like a dissenter in that she's completely out of the system. Like she's, and this is the poem which is the center of that. So if you look at illustrations of Akka Mahadevi or sculptures of Akka Mahadevi in Karnataka, she's this person with sort of unkempt hair, that's covering all her body, and she's naked. So she's, Pratik was saying, they walk out of the institution of marriage. Akka Mahadevi does exactly that. Like some kind of like a Mirabai or something like that. But like at least like this is like, she's rejected all notions of civility. Like, she's not even wearing clothes. Okay. So it's like she's flouting every possible social norm. But she's saying, I am going to be naked. You might other men can rule over this, the fact, but my body is only for Shiva. And the verse that she says at that point when she's walking, she strips her clothes and she's dedicating herself to Shiva, is riding the blue sapphire mountains. So I would like to read the original as well for this. Wearing moonstone for slippers, blowing long horns, O Shiva, when I shall crush you on my pictured breasts, "Oh Lord Channamallikarjuna." So yeah, by the way, like just as Basava refers to Shiva as Kudala Sangama, Akka Mahadevi refers to Shiva as Channamallikarjuna, Mallikarjuna being the god of Srisenam. "Oh Lord Channamallikarjuna, when do I join you, stripped of body's shame and heart's modesty? In our embrace, the bones should rattle. In a welding, the welding mark even should disappear. The knife should enter totally when the arrow enters. Even the feathers should not be seen." Uh, so I mean, I think it's so rich in sort of metaphors and so I think it's generally it's this no it's inseparable. Like we should become like one thing, but I think in the oneness, oneness is often described in like transcendental terms, almost like like there is no object. It's there is a non-physicality to oneness often. Like let's say the word like another word for oneness is Advaita. There is non-duality, but it's a very abstract notion that there is like the entire thing, the essence, the sort of the beginning point of non-duality is that what is visual, what seems like real is not real, what is not real is actually real. That's like the pearl inside the oyster, right? Like the oyster is visible, but the pearl is the reality. But here it's it's like the physical is real, but what I'm desiring is oneness. I mean, I don't know if you can see the point I'm trying to make.
I can, yes, certainly.
Yeah.
And there is also one more thing where she says, one more point is that, see, she becomes, the word she uses is, I mean, moon is my sari and whatever. So, and if you see, Shiva is Digambara. And so in that oneness, even in the physicality, there is oneness in the sense you are also Digambara, having directions as your clothes, Digambara. Now, Akka is also Digambara. She only has the moon and the directions as her clothes. So even in the metaphysical sense, there is union. But even in a very mundane physical sense, now we are in union. I am also a Digambara, you are also a Digambara, kind of the male nudity versus female nudity are at unison here.
Yeah.
And that itself is a point of dissent, I think. I don't think female nudity has been celebrated like this anywhere before in traditional this thing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean that the last thing that you said is important because there is nudity otherwise, and it's like, but I don't know if I don't know how much it was. I think there's some subterranean quality to it. Like it's, for example, there's a lot of talk about sexuality in Indian temple art and all of that, but I don't know how. But where are we taking that? Like how even if it's like a popular temple, even if it's something that people are visiting, I don't know where that the notion of or the trope of unity is going in social terms, or like what is the manifestation? What is the social manifestation of that?
Correct.
Or let's say there's a lot of it about Vamacharya traditions or tantric tradition as well. But again, it's a subterranean. It's a entirely parallel sort of tradition. This is like there are practicing Lingaites today. I mean, they're not living. I mean, I don't know if this particular verse may not have a reflection, but the fact that that she's worshipped, that there are idols of her, and there are there are people probably who are even naming children after her. So that is something really, really curious. I mean, it sounds quite exceptional, I feel. And also this is like the innuendo in this is so rich. I mean, it's like I mean, it puts to lots of these sort of so-called item songs and all to shame, but it's like but the force is sort of like there is some kind of unabashedness to it. Like it's not vulgar. Like if you see what I mean, like there is like there's innuendo, but innuendo is intelligent, and innuendo is always, I think, intelligent. I mean that there is no question about that, but it's not vulgar. Like there is no, it's not under the carpet. It is. Correct. Like there's a force to it. There is, again, as I said, there's some dissent and there is some kind of shrillness.
I think that is another reason why usually Andal and Akka are placed together, because even in Andal's poetry, if we see, there is the very same emotion that you spoke about. Like she says, my breasts have Tuvarai Pirayam Mudale Sangarpitezhunda en Tadamulaigal. So she says, my breasts have just made a sankalpa that I will grow only for Krishna's, pleasure. And she says, Manidavarkendra Pechupadil Vadagilen. And if there is even a speech in the town that I am going to be with a man, then at that moment I'm going to die. These breasts are useless then. So, there is an innuendo for Krishna to say, I've done this just for you. My breasts have grown just for you. Now don't leave me. There is also this shrillness that you're talking about. And I think that's something that Akka and Andal share very.
You'll agree with me. It's just mind blowing how these people have become entirely mainstream figures. And I don't know how much, like what sort of ritual role Akka Mahadevi takes in Lingayat tradition, but Andal takes a very, very important ritual role in Sri Vaishnavism. Right? I mean, it's like a
she's a household figure.
Yeah, it's a household figure, exactly. So it's like household figure in weddings, people dress as brides dress up as Andal and stuff, and she's saying these things. I don't know. I mean, if people even people are reading them and understanding Tamil in it, I'm not sure, but it's I think that is I was going to say it at the end of probably this section of this thing, but I think one phenomenon that I observe is that these are like empty. I mean, they are receptacles. I think these literary traditions, like they won't tell you what you need to do or what you need to think, but they give you space. There is space for all of these things. So let's say there is some we were discussing about Basavanna saying that, and there is this other I mean, you definitely need to read at least one thing. I mean, I like some verse. So there is this Remave, Remave, Kadire Remave.
Kadire Ramave.
Probably we could read one each.
No, I don't have the original. You read.
Okay, fine. I'll read then. But then, so there is. I'll read it, but the point that I'm trying to make is that they provide, I think, sort of basket of motives. They'll give you these tropes. They'll give you these motives, and if you want something, you can dip into it and take them. And somebody else can dip up exactly opposite things also that can be taken from.
Very true.
Like I think that is that's how you need to see dissent in bhakti. Like it is not that like for every Remave you'll find some completely orthodox, conventional, conservative view also. So it's not to say that it's a complete dissent, but there is a space for dissent. It's about whether you want to tap into it or not. Because I mean because let alone the fact that we are tapping into that little space for dissent, and let's say Remave or something. There are well-known, I mean, what we just discussed, Akka Mahadevi or Andal are like well-known household figures, but they are reciting or singing stuff that they said that are completely scandalous, but you're completely ignoring that fact, ignoring the scandal in them.
I think that is marred by the devotion or blindness of the devotion.
Yeah. So that is so it's exactly the opposite of tapping into it. It's like we are sucking the dissent out of the dissent even. Let alone finding dissent in what's already there.
Beautifully put, yeah.
So I'm going to read these two verses from Remave. It's like, I think here, so that's when you see dissent. Like, I mean, again, as I said earlier, Vijay Ramaswamy's contribution is in showing that simply Nayika Bhava is not dissent at all. Like, there is such a normal thing. I mean, you can have this Nayika Bhava and have, say, a million other things also. But there is social, how far you take the metaphysical dissent into social dissent is the point. Like in Akka Mahadevi's case, I would like to think that we do see that, and in Remave. So there is this thing that it's there's something about not just husband and man, but masculinity itself, macho-ness. So the verse is all husbands, and they put men. So I don't know what. Probably the Ganda is, let's say, one word which means both man and husband. So I'm guessing that it must be that's the word probably in the Kannada. All husbands are destroyers of enemy forces. My husband crushes the petals of my mind. Other husbands are husbands of hunters of elephants. My husband is the hunter of my mind. Like very short verse, but like so full of ideas and like sort of irony and like it has this, I don't know if you see that, but it has this sort of rural, like earthy, like that old women have this sort of
very rustic
sort of satire, sort of cold kind of irony, like sort of old age rural wisdom, that kind of thing.
All husbands above, my husband below.
I'm coming to that next. All wives wash and give to their husbands. I do not give my husband. He does not need. All husbands have seeds. My husband has no seeds. My husband's, all husbands are up above. My husband below. I am above him.
So very interestingly, the layers build up. One is a metaphysical, or a philosophical layer where she says, my husband is above these, all husbands are below.
Yeah.
She can refer to Shiva as her husband, and her earthly husband has this thing. So she is rebelling against the institution where she is in. Unlike Akka, like Akka who also did. But and one more thing is admonishing her physical husband for, admonishing the mundane by admonishing her physical husband and adopting the eternal husband of Shiva. She is conveying that anything earthly is going to be temporary, and there is something permanent that you will have to seek. That is a metaphysical where we can go.
Mike, I have another question though. Like other husbands, like I think Hunters of Elephant is a reference to Shiva, right? Because he's Gajasura, Samhara, Samharan. But why is it other husbands? Why is it plural?
That's an interesting question. I didn't think about that.
So when I first read it, I thought she was just saying, these men, they just act like I am real boss, like I'm like, I am a real boss, but these men act like all macho and stuff. So I think I thought she was saying, she was making fun of them for saying, they think they kill elephants is a huge thing. But then I realized, it's actually not that. You don't know. Probably it's also this. Like,
yeah,
probably
it could be that. Yeah.
So because it's saying multiple, plural, but definitely there's that husband of Hunters of Elephant is Shiva. That layer is definitely there. But I'm not sure why it's other husbands are. Or probably it's that others husbands, like in that, like he's the husband of everybody.
Everyone, yeah.
So it could be like, it's like each person thinks of that person as like, same way she's seeing Shiva as her own husband. Everybody, all the Vachanakas are seeing Shiva as their own husband. Probably it could be that everybody's
all Shivas
husband.
Are Nayikas. I mean, yeah.
So there are multiple Shivas that way. Yeah. That could be one.
Oh, that's very interesting. Multiple Shivas. That's like a very postmodern, anachronistic reading of this. Anyway, but Ramaswamy makes a very interesting note in this poem where she says this could mean Viparita Rati, because she says, she doesn't use the word, but she being on top of the man. I mean, in a very sexual context, she takes. I think that argument is a little far-fetched, and she tries to connect it with Tantra just because. This, they are below, I am above. I think it's in a very metaphysical sense, philosophical sense that Remabe is talking about. And to say that it is sexual and therefore it is non-conventional for the woman to be above, and therefore it could be some Tantra influence. I think that's a very far-fetched argument that is being made. I think, personally. And also the other poem where her argument is, I think I have a disagreement, is when she says when Basava is saying, Shiva demands everything from me. When he says that, she says that, okay, he's comparing Shiva to a prostitute when he says he's not a prostitute to just take something from me. So I think that's not the case. He's saying that Shiva is not like a one-night stand where I give something and take something. He's my everything, so I have to give everything to him. So he's not comparing Shiva to prostitute. He's saying everything but that. And I think that interpretation of Vijaya Ramaswamy, I think I am in disagreement with.
Right.
And one thing about this Ganda word you said, that's a very interesting point that she makes is Satyaka, who is unmarried, and she sings this Gandara Ganda. She is the man of men. So one very interesting thing that Professor Ramaswamy is making here is that that word Gandara Ganda, when she says that, men of men, that is what inspires this extreme femininity in these bhaktas. Because he is the man of man, I need to be more feminine. So there needs to be more devotion and submissiveness in me.
Are you saying that it's probably because like you can't beat him in masculinity, so let's not even enter that thing?
No. So the basic premise that he is the Pati and I am the Sati is established.
That's there already,
that is already established.
Okay,
when he is more masculine, I need to be more feminine, and therefore I deserve more submissiveness and obedience and devotion as part of my this thing. So his upping of masculinity is for the submissiveness also to go up, I think. I mean, that's an argument she makes. I find it very interesting.
Right. Yeah. Mm, mm, mm.
So the
I mean,
last,
I don't know. Like the tone. I mean, the tone is what I find most interesting. It's like I don't know much Sangam literature. I don't know Tamil also. Obviously, know that. But there is like there is this kind of sort of like like the avva, like the sort of the Sangam women, or like say even Kannagi, or there's a kind of very bashful, like they love sort of macho men, but at the same time they are like they're confident on their own. Like there is this kind of sort of very abrasive quality. Like I think that is one thing I find in many of these. Uh,
hmm,
yeah, especially let's say in this Remaway also. That's what Remaway. That's what I find.
hmm. One
Uh,
point I think we can end with the last one, perhaps. If you have anything to say,
yeah,
it's
and
okay.
that's about it. I don't have anything else to say.
Yeah, one last thing that I would say is where there's this, because say Akka Nagamma, brother of Basava, I mean, uh, uh, brother of Basava, but she sings Basava as her, this one, say, because Basava is dead, I'm now a widow, she says. But
Hmm.
Basava is her brother.
Hmm.
The
Hmm. Hmm.
relationships are really, really, complex and complicated. And
Hmm.
it
Hmm.
transcends the mundane, I think. I mean, which sister would say, because my brother is dead, I'm a widow?
Hmm. Hmm.
It's very, very interesting. And she also says Channa Basava, my kid Basava. So these bhavas are
Chenna is good.
good, but the
Hmm.
context of that poem is, lovingly she's calling her
Ah, okay,
son
okay, okay,
Basava.
okay. Huh. Yeah,
So,
yeah.
I think these myriad of bhavas that you can take with a human Basava,
Hmm.
then
Hmm.
imagine about the bhavas that you can go with Shiva. I mean, that's very interesting. Last point is that there is this point of becoming androgynous,
Yeah, yeah.
because I adorn uh, woman's
Hmm.
body, men's clothes. There are these poems that alternate between these two. So
Hmm.
she makes this point that you are a bhakta first, and you become the bride, and then you
Hmm.
move on to androgyne.
Hmm.
I don't, just because there is a mention about clothing or something like that. To say that the body itself is, this thing becoming half this, half that, becoming androgynous. I don't think there is a strong evidence for her to
Hmm.
interpret it that way. I think that
Hmm.
one argument is a little far fetched again in this paper.
Right.
Yeah. So yes, I think that's a wrap of Basava
Yeah.
and gender and dissent.
Okay, so as we promised, like I'm going to speak about the next essay, which is by Punekar. It's about I really enjoyed reading the essay. It's quite illuminating. It's about the Varkari tradition, and it looks primarily at the institution of caste, just as caste sort of features in Ramaswamy's essay. Like I mean, even though usually Lingayatism also read in terms of caste, but even though it features like sort of as a small point, even in this gender also features, but it's primarily about caste. And I think I'll just introduce like who the Varkaris are. It comes from the word Vari, which means pilgrimage. So there is it's almost entirely constructed around this one temple shrine of Pandharpur, Vittala, and Vittala is a form of Krishna Vishnu. And the story is that a person named Pundalik, like the base most important episode in that story is that Pundalik, who was once a sort of stray man, Brahmin man who did not really care about his responsibilities, learns about the value of caring for parents, caring for people, and devotion towards God, and uh, and finally Krishna is impressed and descends to earth, but then he's so sort of engrossed in this worship for his parents, caring for his parents, that he can't attend to Krishna. So in the river near his, I don't know which river it is actually. He throws a brick and says, "You stay
Chandrabhaga.
there." Huh? I'm sorry,
Chandrabhaga.
Chandrabala river. Is name.
Mhm.
Yeah. So he throws a brick into the river, and Vitala comes and stands on that brick, and that's the temple shrine of Pandharpur. And a side note, I think we'll mention this even in our sort of description box, is that there's a very interesting book by a person named Ramachandra Chintaman There, which tries to trace the origin of the worship of Vitala, and the the root that the person finds is that he's a god among the Golla Kuruba community. That is the pastoralist sort of shepherd community, and it's the base is the Birappa, which is the tribal god, so anyway, so and let's put that aside. So that's just a side note for some interesting, another interesting book. Probably we could probably read it and discuss it at some point also.
Certainly.
So that's Vittala, and but I think the point of the other book actually is relevant in that the origins itself are have there is a subaltern so-called origin to the god, to the worship of the deity, and it really shows in the literature an entire tradition of the Varkaris. So it's a completely just like the Vachanakaras, or let's say that the Andals or Naimars. There it's an entirely vernacular tradition. So all the literature is in Marathi, and it's a caste-wise, it's a very heterogeneous thing, again similar to Andals and Naimars. They come from various communities, and it's a very tradition that's very conscious of itself. So a lot of traditions, I think, even in, let's say, Sri Vaishnava tradition, I think that happens is that the institution of the hagiography is very important.
Yes.
Like lot of the lineage might not come from the poets themselves. It comes from the retrospective hagiographies. It's through genealogical genealogical building that these connections are established. But I think in the Varkaris, it's self-consciously, that's probably one of the things that you also observe, that the poets are making reference to one another. So it's already like nobody needs to, like a poet does not need to come 500 years later and build a lean, sort of timeline. It's already there. There is already a tradition for some kind of memorialization to happen. And anyways, so there are 4 major poets in this tradition. The 2 are Brahmins, that's Jnanadev and Eknath, and 2 are non-Brahmins, Namdev, a trader, and Tukaram, a Kunbi, a farmer. And each of them, so they all the poet, the essay is talk, and one of the one of the poetesses in the tradition, her name is Bahina Bai. She says that she uses a temple to describe the Varkari tradition. That Jnanadev laid the foundation, Namdev constructed the walls, Eknath built the pillar of the edifice, and Tukaram constructed the spire. Tukaram is the last one. He comes very close to Shivaji's time. Eknath is in the 16th century. But the rest, most of the people in the tradition are from the 13th and 14th centuries. And particularly,
one thing that, sorry to interrupt. The order that you just said, Jnanadev, Namdev, Eknath, Tukaram.
Yeah.
So the biggest follower of Jnanadeva was Namadeva. Jnanadeva is a Brahmin, Namadeva is a non-Brahmin. Yeah. And Namadeva's biggest follower was Eknath, and Eknath is a Brahmin, Namadeva is a non-Brahmin.
Yeah.
And biggest worshipper of, the follower of Eknath was Tukaram, but Eknath is Brahmin, Tukaram is non-Brahmin. This is Brahmin, non-Brahmin, Brahmin, non-Brahmin. That's how it cascades, and that itself is very interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? And but the I'll come to this again probably when we're discussing. When it's a discussion mode, but outside the 4 is Chokha who is a very, very important figure even in Marathi literature generally. You hear about Chokha in, I think, Ambedkarite movement as well, because, and apparently in a critical edition by S.B. Kadam, the Abhangas, it's like Vachanas in Kannada. Abhangas is the literature, the poems of and songs of Chokha. He's called, the first Dalit voice in Indian history. We could probably discuss about what the label means. I think there is, it might be some kind of an anachronistic thing to say, but I think there is something to say, something to be said about it, definitely. So yeah, we can discuss the poems once we come to the point, but broadly, Chokha story is that it's very similar to Kanakadasa's story. So it's a Pandharpur is a temple, so it's a Brahminical institution. Chokha is a cow herder, and so he's a Shudra, he's a Dalit, he's an untouchable, but every day as part of his work he circumambulates the temple, but then all the Brahmins are like, what is the point of this? You are a non-Brahmin, there's no space for you in the system and so on. But then there are many ways in which Krishna manifests and reveals himself to Chokha. But there's a particular incident that's very important, and that is, and this happens, some episode of this kind happens in all sort of lower caste or outsiders tales in Bhakti history, I think. It's that there's a test, test of faith, which is that the gold necklace of Chokamela goes, Vithala Panduranga goes missing, and it's found in Chokamela's house. And then he gets thrashed, and finally Krishna reveals that it's actually him. It's very similar again to
Many
Kanakadasa.
stories all across.
Yeah, Kanakadasa is almost exact, I think, because he's also like the Krishna turns around and the crack opens. So yeah, that is, and then the rest of the essay is about how Eknath memorializes him. Like Eknath does not identify Chokamela as a Dalit, and says, as a Dalit, he was the greatest devotee of the Lord Krishna, and is an open, sort of vocal and very frank and sort of candid worshipper of Chokamela. Like Chokamela is the very model of Krishna worship, and just as men in many of these traditions become women, nayikas in the worship of the Lord, Eknath as a Brahmin becomes a Dalit, and that is. I mean, there is. I don't know. I mean, if it has such myriad implications for Dalit politics and so on, and I think it's such an interesting phenomenon that just this person becoming a lower caste person to worship Krishna, and there's a lot of literature about that as well. So that is the introduction to Varkaris, Chokamela, and Eknath.
Yes. So again, in this Eknath Chokamela relationship, I think is the most interesting thing. And after a gap of 200 years, Eknath chooses Chokamela out of Jnandev and Namdev and figures like that, and chooses not to just eulogize him, but to become somebody like that, to impersonate them. I think that as you made, it's a very, very interesting thing. One more thing is, I mean, being a Brahmin and being the upper, creme de la creme of the society, he wishes to use his privilege to give voice to these Dalit, this thing. I mean, if it can be viewed that way.
Yeah, I mean, but I think I'm sure there will be some other alternative interpretations, especially by like Dalit politicians of today, people talking Dalit politics today, which is that he is, there's this whole thing about you cannot represent something that you're not, the experience of somebody that you're not. But I think he's doing something different. It's that it's out of his adulation for Chokamela as a person that he's doing it. Like, I don't think he thinks that he's a Dalit himself. I think that's clear because he's a Brahmin. I think that's also clear in several of his work, a lot of his work. But he's saying that he really respects, he loves Chokamela's work, and since Chokamela is a Dalit, and he's by doing this, he's trying to show that Dalits, like, it's similar to what we discussed in Gandhi's thing also, which is that he's talking not to Dalits, but he's talking to Brahmins.
Exactly.
That I think is very important, Dalit politics as well, not just hold on. All right, so Amma. Yeah, so as we were discussing, I mean, we've discussed several times, I think, is that the conversation is with Brahmins. I think it's to show that that Dalits also, like, the caste is irrelevant when it comes to bhakti, when it comes to Vithala, and guess what? Even I don't mind calling myself a Dalit. Like, I don't mind. So it is like breaking untouchability. It's like going and walking in the Dalit Avada. So there is a lot of, like, in this essay, there's so much reference, and I think actually this untouchability commensality, I think that's the term, is very critical. Like, even Ambedkar says that one of the essential institutions through which untouchability is progressed and caste is sort of enforced, bolstered in modern society or Indian society, is that segregation of meals. That not just people are eating different foods, which obviously will happen anywhere in the world, but also that they're eating separately, and they're like, there is no way that they're going to eat in the same area at all.
Very true.
And there is, I mean, I don't think the essay drew back to the statistical frequency of that. It just said there's multiple stories where the Shudras don't get fed, and some Brahmins say, there'll be some leftover foods, you can eat that or something. or I think yeah, actually Eknath says there is some food that's left over from the cooked food. You can eat that, but then the Shudra says, Brahmins tell us that leftover food of what other people eat, like the touched food is what we are supposed to eat, and then he goes and cooks food for them and feeds them, goes to
Separately.
Dalit Wada. So
Again, one more thing in here with respect to food is that the claim made by Chokamela that Panduranga Vithala comes and eats in my house and getting thrashed for it. What are you even saying? Even we don't come, Bhagavan comes or what? It's another thing.
I think the first thing that he's trying to break is untouchability through commensality. It's common eating, and what he's doing through literature is that do you see what I'm saying? It's a meta version of breaking flouting untouchability rather than appropriating their voice. It is like saying, I will enter the street of the Dalit. So I will enter the voice of the Dalit just like I'm entering the street of the Dalit. He's trying to break untouchability rather than taking the voice of the Dalit. So for example, he says this very amazing verse. I think this is what I meant by self-conscious sort of hagiography already in place, which is he's saying, God baked pots with Gora, drove cattle with Choka, cut grass with Savata Mali, Gardner Mali, wove garments with Kabir, colored hide with Ravidas. So it's, other traditions like, Kabir and Ravidas in North India. Sold meat with butcher Sajana. I mean, that is absolutely mind-blowing, I think, that line. Melted gold with Narahari, carried cow dung with Janabai, and even became the Mahad messenger of Damaji. Which is, there is this already there is this tradition that they've already built, and each person is free to quote from the other, work together as a collaboration. I think you were going to say something.
No, what I was saying is, in your previous point, Choka, in the voice of Choka, Eknath is addressing Brahmins, as you said. And now what he's doing is he's literally reversing the order. In the sense, now there's a Dalit questioning the Brahmin. And the Dalit putting Dalit a little, in a superior position than the Brahmin. And now I would again draw a comparison with the same thing with Tamil Nadu in the Alvars, where the hagiography of Tirupan Alvar, if you see, he is being, the Brahmin is acting hegemonically, saying you are not supposed to sing in the banks of Kaveri, get lost. But Ranganatha says, I only want to see him, and he bleeds for him. And still, see, the point of caste being still preserved, yet being transcended. I think that is very important. Now, when the Brahmin comes and asks Tirupan Alvar that, okay, Ranganatha wants to see you come in, the Tirupan Alvar says, I can't set foot because I am a Shudra. The temple. Therefore, the Brahmin carries him on the shoulder. See, now your foot is not on the temple, so come and see. Right? So now the equation is reversed, yet the rule is not transcended.
So I think that there is this some separation of metaphysics and social.
Yes.
So it's like the untouchability is still preserved of some kind. The Brahmin is still touching him, but there is some untouchability still going on.
Yes, that's still there. So the same case, I would want to bring it in the context of Choka. I mean, that is hagiographic, this is literary, but even then, here if we see one poem that she also, Punekar also quotes, when Choka becomes the Mahar of Ayodhya, right? And he says, he is still cleaning the dirt of Ayodhya's palace. So his caste is not transcended, except that he is not doing it for the Brahmin here, he is doing it for Rama and Sita. So there is a, transgression of caste. There is a preservation of caste also. I think that is the interplay that's
But again, if I had to bring in the same lens that I used to say how Eknath is actually not appropriating, it's that if let's say he was not doing his, he was doing the other caste's job, okay? Then he's becoming this is the only way he's like, let's say there's no word Mahad in this. Let's say there's no word Mahad. So the only way he can, he can become, the Mahad-ness of Choka can be sort of indicated is through the activity. So if you want to show that that he is a Mahad, despite that he's doing this, you need this probably.
Yes, that I'll agree. That's
so there is so I mean it's slightly different. I mean, I'm saying what the Tirupan Alvar case, this is slightly different in that this there is some assertion in this. Like if you don't do this, There's no assertion, because if he just goes in as anybody else, you could it would have been an opposite. No, it would have been that Choka was allowed into Ayodhya because he's become a Brahmin now.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Yes.
Like, I mean, it's a very complicated thing. I mean,
Yes.
right. So, but I mean, it's there. He's Tirupan Alvar is he's a Shudra. I don't know what occupation his was.
He was
a Shudra,
singing,
and untouchability is being flouted in that he's entering the temple and he's sitting on the very shoulders of another Brahmin, priest. But some rule is still being followed. But here, the rule probably is that Choka wants to show that I am a Dalit, I'm still going to do this. There is defiance probably. Like, there is, I mean, it's hard to really, but then the question also comes, the question that is thrown at Gandhi, which is that you just want Bangis to keep being shit.
Yes.
So, I mean, but I mean, here it's Choka's own voice. So there is
Choka's own voice, but I mean, by Eknath again. That complex.
So I think in this particular, which one? This, I think the
that is one of the Bharuts. That is one of the Bharuts of Eknath only.
Okay.
So again, this Brahmin Dalit equation. One more interesting thing is the scribe for all Choka Mela's poem has been a Brahmin. That Ms. Punekar writes, Ananta Bhatta.
Yeah.
So that's again very interesting. This is not 200 years after Choka, during the period of Choka himself. But there is also one very interesting line that I would just read verbatim from her work. She says, Choka Mela was not allowed inside the temple. He just was in the gate and he was singing. And she says even after his death, he's still outside the temple only. And that's a very, she says, in death as in life, Choka would never go into the temple. And that's a very, very nice statement.
Yeah, I mean, I think I confused two different Abhangs. And actually in this case, that I think if an Eknath is impersonating Choka, I think what the level that the criticism that is leveled against Gandhi is true, which is that Eknath, the criticism could be like, I mean, but I think what Eknath has already done is a huge leap. So, I mean, I would not be 100% comfortable with that criticism, but it would still be valid in some ways. Is that Eknath wants Choka, as you just said, Eknath is fine with Choka going so far, but he's he's sensationalizing his Mahardness, something like that.
He's perhaps romanticizing the Mahardness.
Like, so we don't know how much of it is assertion or how much of it is sort of suppression. Like, he's just trying to repress him. Like, you're like, give him God and he'll be fine with his status. That kind of thing.
That I think is a very extreme view to take. Given, I mean, we cannot view it with an anachronistic lens. I mean, for that society, this much is too much.
He's a huge. That's exactly what I feel as well. And so I think the reason I got confused is because there's another Bhang by Choka Mela himself, and hold on, I'll get that. Yeah, it's about purity, and it was. I mean, this is just like absolutely scandalous verse, Vachana by Akkamahadevi. It's as scandalous as that, and probably even more, because metaphysically, the implications are just phenomenal. So it is the premise of this is that it is a materialistic poem in that it questions. So the premise of all of this Bhakti literature is that all the things that you're calling caste is actually something that comes to the body, but when the body is so immaterial, the body is not. There's impermanence to the body and sort of inconsequentiality to the body. Why should caste matter? That's like the primary argument, I think, that goes through all of these traditions. But if the substances are impure, just if the physical substances are impure, just think about how many things that you call pure are actually impure. That is the question that Choka is asking in this, and it's Choka's own verse.
Yes.
And I would say that this kind of verse, I don't think Eknath or any other Brahmin writers can produce. Because this is going against the entire, they're only going to go so far in terms of their criticism of Brahminism. But this is like almost this sort of demolishing Brahminism, almost like slashing it.
This context, I think it's the hagiographic tradition that is documented by Mahipati much later, 1700, early 1700s. It says after giving the food that you spoke about to the Shudra, he went. Eknath goes to Chandrabhaga and takes a dip because again,
Yeah.
both exist. I mean,
Yeah.
transgression as well
Yeah.
as this thing. Yeah.
So yeah, I'll read this verse. It's amazing. Five elements compound the body impure. All things mix thrive in the world. Then who is pure and who impure? The body is rooted in impurity from the beginning to the end. Endless impurities heap themselves. Who is it can be made impure? Says Choka. I am struck with wonder. Can there be any such beyond pollution? Vedas and the Shastras polluted. Puranas inauspicious, impure. The body, the soul contaminated. The manifest being is the same. Brahma polluted. Vishnu too. Vishnu too is polluted. I mean, that's like Vittala is Vishnu himself, right?
Yes.
Shankar is impure, inauspicious. Birth impure. Dying is impure, says Choka. Pollution stretches without beginning and end. So I think it's this verses like this which probably sort of become like sort of a kernel for the point that the point that he's the Dalit sort of first Dalit voice or whatever, because it is not only is it dissenting like all the other ones, saying, how is caste even consequential in this bhakti thing, but even its root is somewhat different. The root is, the root is opposite of all the other roots, which is that since the rest of it, the body is impure, all of these things are impure. So soul is what matters, and soul is the same for everyone. Therefore, all are the same. But here he's saying, how can you? I mean, if body is impure, everything else is impure. Therefore, body is not. I mean, the body is what I have, and I respect my occupation. I respect my familiar life. I respect my body. In spite of this body, I am equal before God. Like that I think that is that I think I think that's farther than any other literature that I've actually read. I mean, maybe there is other stuff. I mean, if you can think of something, you can talk about that. But like this is it's very very far reaching. That like this sort of it entirely lacks the kind of disdain that people often accuse spiritualism of. Towards the body, towards desire, towards these very real mundane things, and he's embracing all of that. It is. I mean, it is like I mean, if there is so much potential, let's say, for Dalit politics in Chokamela. Because, I mean, for one, he is Dalit, and also this kind of, it's exactly the kind of thing that we see, even in Insta stories, right? That there is this, like there's no kind of appropriation, there's no kind of cultural appropriation or anything of that sort. It's total embrace of the actual reality. Yeah.
That's actually overwhelming.
Yeah. So, so I mean, I think we've already discussed a lot.
Yes.
Do you have anything interesting else to point out?
Nothing, I guess. That maybe this one Abhang's his one verse that we enjoyed reading. Maybe Dhav ghali vithu ata chalu nako mand maj mariti badve kahi tari aparadh. So where the Brahmins are beating him when he says, oh Vithala, you only caused all of this, and now these people are beating me. I think that was. I mean, I just wanted to end with his original verse.
Yeah.
But,
one last point though about this gender question of gender. So there is this. It's like an afterthought. I mean, because it's almost like if you need to talk about caste, you need to speak about gender as well. I mean, it's I'm not making fun of the idea. I think it's really important.
Yeah.
Hold on. Let me. Oh, yeah. So there is this. There's this line in the work. It says Chokamela's wife Soira and his sister Nirmala speak of their Mahar caste and its location in caste hierarchy. Though one long poem narrates Soira's travels of being married to householder Bhakta, such as Chokamela, who is always lost in devotion to Vittal, no poem questions his centrality in the family. And the only other one that she talks about is Kanhopata, the courtesan, who speaks about the vulnerability of her position. But I think these were added like afterthought. So one thing I would have wanted to know is if there are more number of people in the Varkari tradition. That's I mean, there probably are. I mean, there probably is a paper intended to be written about exactly this. But I mean, but I think Chokamela sort of like rises above the rest. It's like
yes, truly.
Yeah. So And
so this was a very, very, very interesting discussion.
Very interesting discussion. I agree. Hopefully we will be back this time. Really, we will be back very soon with something more interesting,
Certainly.
interesting like this again.
Yes.
And is that it, Pratik?
Yes, certainly.
Yes, okay, see you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Namaskaram.